Welcome to the channel, my alien friends. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Enjoy listening. The vast expanse of space stretched endlessly before Captain Alea Saros, the stars distant and cold, twinkling like silent witnesses to humanity's last hope. She stood at the bridge of Aurora's dream, her gaze fixed on the holographic display showing their final destination, Alcyon Prime. A planet promising water, a breathable atmosphere, and perhaps salvation for the remaining fragments of the human race. Alea's fingers traced the edges of the console absently. After 2 centuries of drifting through the void, carrying thousands of frozen colonists, the Aurora's dream had reached its target. It should have felt like triumph, but instead, a knot of anxiety tightened in her chest. Nothing ever came easy for them. Humanity was a species cursed to battle for survival, even when it seemed within reach. Approaching orbit, came the cool voice of Rhea Valeris, Alea's second-in-command and closest confidant. Rhea's tone was as steady as always, though Alea could feel the tension beneath her words, a barely perceptible undercurrent only she would notice after years of working together. Rhea, standing beside her at the command console, glanced over, her sharp eyes catching Alea's unease. Still no communication from the surface. They're either waiting for us, or we've misjudged their entire civilization. The captain nodded, eyes narrowing at the data on the screen. They know we're here. Too much activity on their satellites, but why remain silent? Her voice was a low murmur, more to herself than Rhea. I don't like it, Rhea continued, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her hand hovered over the console, fingers twitching, as if ready to spring into action at the first sign of trouble. If they've been observing us, surely they know we'd expect a welcome by now. Alea's mind wandered back to the records they'd studied before arriving. Alcyon Prime, rich in water, advanced in technology. Though no direct contact had ever been made, deep space probes had intercepted signals suggesting an advanced civilization, possibly one that could help Earth's last colonies rebuild. But for all their knowledge, the silence now felt ominous. Let's not assume hostility just yet, Alea said, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. Prepare the landing team. We'll initiate contact in person if we have to. Rhea hesitated, a rare flicker of doubt crossing her face. Are you sure we're ready for that? I mean, we don't even know if it's safe. Safe isn't a luxury we can afford, Alea replied sharply, the weight of responsibility heavy on her shoulders. Thousands of lives hung in the balance, frozen in cryostasis, waiting for her to make the right call. There was no room for fear or second-guessing. We either make this planet our new home, or we drift through space until the Aurora fails. Rhea didn't argue. She knew better than anyone the stakes at hand, but Alea sensed something deeper lurking beneath her practical objections. She could feel Rhea's gaze lingering on her, protective, worried, more than what protocol required. It had always been that way between them, unspoken but palpable, a bond forged through battles fought side by side and crises averted by sheer determination. Understood, Rhea said finally, her voice quieter now, almost resigned. She turned to leave, her posture stiff, a wall between them that had grown thicker over the years. Alea watched her go, a pang of something personal clawing at her chest, but there was no time for it. There never was. She returned to the view screen, eyes narrowing on the planet below, its swirling blue oceans eerily calm. Too calm. The comms crackled to life unexpectedly, a jarring intrusion into the stillness of the bridge. Alea straightened, her heart skipping a beat. Captain, we're receiving a signal, a crew member announced. It's coming from the surface. Put it through, Alea ordered, leaning forward, her breath catching in her throat. A moment passed before a voice filled the bridge, a deep, male voice, resonant and smooth but with an unsettling edge to it. This is Edrin of Alcyon Prime. We have been expecting you, Aurora's dream. The air in the room seemed to thin. Alea exchanged a glance with Rhea, who had paused at the doorway, eyes wide with suspicion. She could feel the tension simmering between them, but now wasn't the time. This is Captain Alea Saros, she replied, her voice steady despite the flicker of alarm that surged in her chest. We come in peace, seeking to establish contact and explore the possibility of settlement. There was a pause, and then Edrin's voice returned, calm yet curiously detached. We know of your mission, Captain. Your journey has been long, and your people must be weary. Allow me to extend an invitation to the surface where we can discuss matters of mutual interest. Alea's stomach tightened. The calculated nature of his words struck her as odd. There was no warmth, no surprise, just a sense that they had been under observation for much longer than she had realized. Rhea stepped forward, her expression tight with mistrust. Captain, this feels off. We should reconsider how we approach this. I know, Alea muttered under her breath, weighing the risks. Every fiber of her being screamed caution, but she had no choice. Their survival was bound to this planet, and diplomacy, however precarious, was their only option. "Tell him we'll be there soon," Alaya said, turning back to the comms. Her voice was firm, but inside her mind raced with doubt. "We accept your invitation." Edrin's reply was instant. "Very well, Captain Saris. We shall meet soon. I look forward to our encounter." The transmission cut out abruptly, leaving the bridge in silence. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared speak. Rhea approached, her eyes locking with Alaya's. "We need to be careful. This doesn't feel right." Alaya nodded, though something told her that being careful wouldn't be enough. There was something darker at play here, something hidden just beneath the surface of that planet. She could feel it in her bones, a haunting echo in the void that gnawed at her instincts. And yet, she couldn't stop now. "Prepare the shuttle," she said, her voice low and resolute. "We're going down." As Rhea turned to carry out the order, Alaya caught her arm, their eyes meeting for a brief, electric moment. The intensity between them was always there, lurking beneath every command, every shared glance. But neither could afford to acknowledge it. Not now. "Stay close," Alaya said softly, her grip tightening just slightly before she let go. It was the closest she'd come to admitting what lingered unspoken between them. Rhea's lips twitched, a hint of something softer beneath the soldier's mask. "I always do." And with that, the two women prepared to descend into the unknown, with Alaya's heart divided between the mission before her and the emotions she'd long kept buried beneath duty and survival. In the void of space, echoes of what could be were drowned by the looming threats of what lay ahead. The hiss of the shuttle doors opening echoed through the metal corridors of Aurora's dream, a sound that sent a shiver down Captain Alaya Saris' spine. She stood on the landing platform, eyes fixed on the shuttle that had just ascended from Alcyon Prime's surface. The planet's muted twilight glow reflected off the ship's sleek surface, casting an eerie, ghost-like shimmer in the dim, artificial light of the ship's bay. Beside her, Rhea stood tall and silent, her eyes scanning the shuttle with a suspicion that mirrored Alaya's own. Something about the invitation to the surface, the carefully measured words of Edrin, had gnawed at her since the transmission. It was as if they were walking into a game without knowing the rules. The shuttle doors slid open, and a figure stepped out. Tall, humanoid, but unmistakably alien. His features were sharp and angular, too precise to be human, with a gaze that seemed to weigh and measure every detail of the world around him. His silver hair caught the light, cascading down his back in a way that almost looked too perfect, too engineered. "Edrin?" Alaya murmured, recognizing him instantly from the brief, holographic communication. He moved with an unnatural grace, his body language fluid yet controlled, as if every step was calculated to convey authority. The air between them tightened as he approached, and Alaya's instincts screamed that this was no ordinary visitor. "Captain Saris." Edrin's voice was smooth, as it had been over the comms, almost too smooth, a sound that felt like it was crafted to disarm. "I trust your crew as well." Alaya straightened, her eyes narrowing as she met his gaze. "We're managing. Though I'm sure you can understand, this isn't a typical encounter for us. You're the first of your kind we've ever met." "And yet," Edrin replied with a small, unsettling smile, "we have known of your people for quite some time." Alaya's pulse quickened. There it was, that undercurrent of something darker, the suggestion that they'd been watched. That humanity, with all its struggles and suffering, had been under observation by these silent, advanced beings, and they had chosen not to intervene. She exchanged a glance with Rhea, who gave a barely perceptible nod, confirming her own unease. "We're here to discuss mutual interests," Alaya said, keeping her voice neutral. "Why don't you tell us more about what Alcyon Prime can offer us?" Edrin's eyes flickered with amusement, his thin lips curling slightly. "Of course, but perhaps I could first be granted a tour of Aurora's dream. I am quite eager to learn more about your civilization." His tone was polite, but there was something predatory in it, like a wolf circling a campfire, observing before pouncing. Before Alaya could respond, Rhea stepped forward, her voice colder than usual. "That's not how this works. You're the guest here. You're on our ship. Protocol demands you share more about your intentions before we proceed any further." The tension between Rhea and Edrin was palpable, electric in the air. Alaya could see the way Edrin's expression hardened just for a moment, the mask slipping. And then, just as quickly, it was back, the smooth facade of diplomacy. "Of course," Edrin said, inclining his head slightly, though the gesture felt more like a concession in a game than genuine agreement. "Forgive me, Commander Valeris. I am eager, but I understand your caution. Alcyon Prime's history with visitors has been complicated." Alaya's stomach twisted at the implications behind his words. What visitors? Who had come before? She swallowed her unease and gestured for him to follow. Let's talk in the conference room. They walked through the dimly lit corridors, the hum of the ship's systems the only sound that accompanied them. Edrin's presence was a constant, unnerving reminder of how vulnerable they were. His confidence felt like a challenge, a quiet assertion that his world was more advanced, more powerful, and that they were merely guests in his orbit. Inside the conference room, Edrin settled into a chair, his posture languid yet alert. Alaya remained standing, her hands resting on the back of her own chair as Rhea took her place at the edge of the room, her eyes never leaving Edrin. So, Alaya began, her voice steady, let's cut through the pleasantries. What is it you want from us? Edrin's gaze darkened slightly, and for the first time, Alaya sensed the weight of the game they were playing. He leaned forward, his fingers steepling together in front of him. What I want, Captain Saris, is quite simple. I want knowledge. Your people possess something unique, something we have long observed, but never fully understood. And what's that? Rhea's voice cut through the air like a blade, sharp and challenging. Your adaptability, Edrin answered, his eyes flicking toward Rhea, then back to Alaya. Your resilience. You survive where others would fail. Your history is filled with struggles, and yet you persevere. That is what makes you fascinating to us. It's why we've been watching. Alaya felt the ground shift beneath her, watching. The word hung in the air like a threat, an unspoken power that Edrin held over them. Her heart raced, but outwardly she remained calm. They had come too far to back down now. And what does that mean for our future? Alaya asked, her voice quieter now, but no less resolute. Edrin smiled again, that same unsettling curve of his lips. It means, Captain, that we are only just beginning. Alaya's pulse throbbed in her temples, but she held his gaze. There was a storm coming. She could feel it brewing in the space between his words, and she wasn't sure if they were ready for what lay ahead. But one thing was certain. Whatever game Edrin was playing, they were already caught in it. And there was no turning back. Captain Alaya Saris stared out at the endless twilight of Alcyon Prime from the viewport of the conference room. The swirling hues of blue and purple skies cast a strange ethereal glow over the horizon, illuminating the alien world with a beauty that felt haunting and dangerous all at once. Yet, no matter how stunning the view, the knot in her stomach refused to loosen. Something was deeply wrong beneath the surface of this planet, and she could feel it creeping into her thoughts like a shadow. She wasn't alone in her unease. Rhea stood nearby, her arms crossed and jaw clenched, watching Alaya in that quiet, protective way she always did. There was a tension between them now, unspoken but heavy in the air. Rhea's suspicions about Edrin had only deepened since the alien scientist's arrival. Alaya could see it in the sharpness of her gaze, in the way her fingers twitched, ready for conflict. She knew Rhea was waiting for her to make a call, to trust her instincts and pull away from whatever web Edrin was spinning around them. But Alaya had responsibilities beyond the personal connection between her and Rhea. She was captain of the Aurora's dream, and their survival hung on their ability to find common ground with Alcyon Prime. Even if every instinct screamed at her to be cautious, to question Edrin's motives, she couldn't afford to push him away. Not yet. It's not right, Rhea said suddenly, breaking the tense silence. Her voice was low but firm, the edge of frustration seeping into her words. He's playing us, Alaya. I can feel it. Alaya turned, meeting her gaze. There it was again, Rhea's protectiveness, the unspoken care woven through every word. She wasn't just worried about the mission. She was worried about Alaya, and that made it harder to keep her own walls up. I know, Alaya replied softly, her voice weighed down by exhaustion. I feel it too. But we don't have the luxury of walking away. We need their help, Rhea. You know that as well as I do. Rhea stepped closer, her brows furrowed in frustration. Do we? Or do we just think we do because it's the only option that's been laid out for us? We don't know what kind of traps he's setting. Alaya looked away, back toward the glowing skyline. She wanted to agree. Every part of her wanted to trust Rhea's instincts, to believe that they could turn back before it was too late. But they had come so far, had sacrificed so much to reach this point. She couldn't allow doubt to cloud her judgment. We have to tread carefully, Alaya said, her voice regaining some of its edge. Edrin is smart. He knows more about us than we know about him, and that gives him the upper hand. If we push too hard, we risk losing the only chance we have to make this planet work for us. Rhea's eyes darkened, her posture stiffening. And if we don't push back, we risk becoming his pawns. I don't want to watch you walk into his trap, Alaya. The softness in her voice caught Alaya off guard. stirring something deep inside her that she had long buried. Ria's loyalty had always been unwavering, but there was more now, an intensity that went beyond duty. Alaya could feel it in the way Ria stood closer than necessary, the heat between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of everything they'd left unsaid. Before Alaya could respond, the door slid open, breaking the tension. Edrin entered, his presence like a cold gust of wind. His silver hair caught the light, and his expression was as unreadable as ever. He smiled politely, but his eyes lingered on Alaya longer than they should have. "Captain Saras, Commander Valeris," he greeted, his voice smooth and practiced. "I trust you've had time to consider my offer." Ria stiffened at the mention of his offer, the vague proposal he had dangled before them like bait. Knowledge, resources, survival, all wrapped up in the secrecy of Alcyon's political landscape. Alaya knew they were being led into a deeper game, one where they didn't know all the rules. "We've considered," Alaya said cautiously, her tone betraying nothing of her inner conflict. "But I need more answers before we can move forward." Edrin's eyes flickered with something, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. He stepped closer, his movements fluid and calculated, like a predator assessing its prey. "What is it you wish to know, Captain?" Alaya held his gaze, searching for cracks in the carefully constructed facade. "Your people, your society. You've told us very little about the political instability here, yet it's clear we're stepping into something bigger than just diplomatic relations. What aren't you telling us?" The silence that followed was thick, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Ria moved a fraction closer, her body tense, ready for whatever Edrin's response might be. For a moment, Edrin simply stared at her, and then, slowly, his smile faded. "Alcyon is complicated," he admitted, his voice losing some of its practiced charm. "There are factions here, as I've alluded to, power struggles that have been building for decades. Your arrival has disrupted certain plans." "What plans?" Ria interjected, her voice sharp. "What exactly are we disrupting?" Edrin's gaze shifted to her, cold and calculating. "The balance of power. There are those who see your arrival as an opportunity to gain control over Alcyon's future, and there are those who will stop at nothing to prevent that." Alaya's chest tightened. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but it was worse than she'd imagined. They weren't just dealing with a planet in need of aid. They were caught in the middle of a civil war, one where they could easily become pawns. "Why didn't you tell us this from the start?" Alaya asked, her voice low, anger creeping into her tone. "You've put us in danger without warning." Edrin's expression softened, a hint of something close to regret crossing his face. "Because, Captain, I didn't believe you would come if you knew the truth. And I needed you to come. Your people may be the only hope we have left." His words hung in the air, a grim reminder of the stakes they all faced. Alaya's mind raced, trying to grasp the full implications of what Edrin was saying. Was he using them, manipulating their desperation for his own gain? Or was he truly trying to save his world, just as she was trying to save hers? Ria's hand brushed against Alaya's arm, just a light touch, a silent reminder that she wasn't alone in this. It was enough to steady her. Alaya's eyes hardened as she faced Edrin. "No more secrets. If you want our help, you tell us everything from now on. Otherwise, we leave this planet, and you can deal with your war on your own." Edrin hesitated for a moment, then nodded. A slow, deliberate gesture. "Very well, but be careful, Captain. The deeper you dig, the more dangerous this game becomes." Alaya's heart pounded in her chest, the weight of his words sinking in. Beneath the surface of Alcyon Prime, darkness was stirring, and now there was no turning back. The dim lights of Aurora's dream flickered in the silence of the command deck. Captain Alaya Saras sat at the head of the room, her gaze fixed on the swirling hologram of Alcyon Prime projected in front of her. The fractured political landscape of the planet lay before her like a tangled web, one she now found herself ensnared in, trapped between the promises of Edrin and the ominous threats lurking beneath the surface. Around her, the senior crew murmured amongst themselves, their voices low and tense, waiting for her to speak. They were anxious, unsettled by the recent revelations of Alcyon's civil war and the role their arrival might play in it. But it wasn't just the crew she had to manage, it was herself. Every choice felt heavier now, weighed down by the uncertainty of who they could trust. "We're being used," Ria said, breaking the silence. She stood near the viewport, arms crossed, her expression grim. Her eyes never left the hologram of Alcyon as she spoke. "Edrin's brought us into the middle of a power struggle we have no business being part of, and now we're on the brink of making decisions that could destroy us." Alaya felt the words hit her with a force she'd been trying to avoid. She knew Ria was right. Deep down, she had known it from the moment Edrin had stepped foot on their ship. but to hear it said aloud so plainly brought a knot of tension to her chest. It wasn't just a matter of diplomacy anymore. The stakes had escalated. The crew was growing restless, divided between those who trusted Alea's leadership and those who questioned it. "I agree with Commander Valeris," Lieutenant Graves spoke up, his voice laced with frustration. "We don't know what kind of game Edrin is playing, but if we side with him, we risk becoming collateral in their civil war. We should pull out, now." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, but Alea could see the fear behind their words. They were scared, not just of Edrin and the dangers on Alcyon, but of the unknown that awaited them if they failed to secure this planet. After centuries adrift in space, they were desperate for hope, for a future. Alcyon had seemed like that future, but now it felt more like a trap. "Pulling out isn't an option," Alea said, her voice cutting through the murmur. She stood, commanding the room's attention, though inside she felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. "We don't have the resources to keep wandering the galaxy. Alcyon Prime is our only chance at survival. If we leave, we condemn ourselves, and the colonists we carry, to a slow death." Ria's jaw tightened, her eyes flashing with frustration. "But if we stay, we might be condemning them to something worse. We don't know who Edrin really is, Alea. He's hiding something. I can feel it." Alea turned to face her, their eyes locking in a battle of wills. The tension between them had been simmering for days, ever since Edrin's true intentions had come to light. But beneath Ria's anger, Alea could see the fear not just for the crew, but for her. Ria was always trying to protect her, even when it put them at odds. Even when it complicated the relationship they both pretended didn't exist. "And what would you have us do?" Alea challenged, her voice sharper than she intended. "Cut ties and hope we find another planet before our systems fail? We don't have that luxury, Ria. This isn't just about us. It's about trust." Ria snapped, taking a step closer, her eyes blazing. "And right now, I don't trust him. And I'm not sure I can trust you if you keep letting him lead us into a fight we can't win." The words stung more than Alea wanted to admit. She held Ria's gaze, her heart pounding with a mix of anger and something more complicated, something she didn't have the time or space to confront. Ria had always been the one to push her, to challenge her decisions. But this felt personal. The divide between them had never been wider, and Alea wasn't sure how to bridge it without losing control of the situation. "We don't have a choice," Alea said, her voice softening, but no less firm. "I'm not blind to the risks, but if we pull back now, we lose everything. We need to play this carefully, find a way to navigate their politics without becoming their pawns." Ria's expression hardened, her mouth a thin line. "And if we can't?" Alea didn't answer. She didn't need to. The room fell into silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. The fracture within the crew was growing wider, and with it, the crack in Alea's resolve. She felt it deep down, that nagging sense that things were spiraling out of her control. But she couldn't show it. Not now. Not when so many lives depended on her. "We're not backing out," Alea said finally, her tone decisive, cutting through the tension. "But we'll be cautious. We'll demand more transparency from Edrin. And we'll keep our distance until we know where we stand. No more blind trust." The crew exchanged uneasy glances, but there were nods of reluctant agreement. Lieutenant Graves stood, offering a tight-lipped acknowledgement. "As long as we proceed with caution." "I'm with you, Captain." One by one, the others followed suit, until only Ria remained unmoved, her gaze lingering on Alea with a mix of concern and hurt. It pained Alea more than she could express, but she held firm. She had to. "We'll make this work," Alea said, trying to reassure herself as much as the others. "We don't have another option." The meeting adjourned and the crew filed out, leaving Alea and Ria alone in the dimly lit room. The silence between them was thick, heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. Alea felt the distance between them growing, even as Ria stood so close. "You're pushing too hard," Ria said quietly, her voice a mix of frustration and something softer, something that tugged at Alea's heart. I don't want to see you break." Alea swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing herself to maintain control. She couldn't afford to break. Not now. Not ever. "I won't," she said softly, though she wasn't sure she believed it. "I can't." Ria hesitated, her eyes searching Alea's for a moment longer before she sighed, turning toward the door. "Just don't forget who's on your side." As Ria left the room, the quiet hum of the ship enveloped Alea, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The fractures were deepening, not just within her crew, but within herself, and she feared that soon something would break beyond repair. The sky above Alcyon Prime burned in a kaleidoscope of violent colors, crimson, orange, and deep violet streaking across the horizon like wounds in the fabric of the heavens. Explosions echoed through the once silent cities, a brutal symphony of war that tore through the alien air. Captain Alea Saris stood on the balcony of the crumbling outpost, her heart pounding in sync with the chaos around her, eyes fixed on the battlefield below. It hadn't taken long for the fragile peace to shatter. Edrin had underestimated the power of the opposing factions. The moment word of the humans' arrival spread, Alcyon's fractured political landscape erupted into all-out war. Armies of rival factions stormed the capital, each claiming their right to rule the planet. And with it, control over the future of Alea's people. They were no longer explorers or survivors. They were pawns in a struggle far larger than themselves. "We have to move," Rhea shouted over the roar of nearby gunfire. She emerged from the doorway, her face streaked with dirt and sweat, her uniform torn at the shoulder, exposing a bloodied arm. Her voice was fierce, but her eyes betrayed the fear she was trying to suppress. "They're breaking through the lower defense lines. If we don't evacuate now, we won't make it." Alea turned to face her, every muscle in her body screaming with the weight of her responsibility. Behind her, the crew scrambled to gather supplies, weapons, and whatever they could carry. But it was chaos. They were soldiers now, not scientists or explorers. The reality of their situation had sunk in all too quickly. If they didn't fight, they would die. Alea swallowed the bile rising in her throat. "I gave Edrin my word," she said, her voice rough, barely audible. "He promised us protection, and he failed," Rhea snapped, taking a step closer, her voice rising with the urgency of the moment. "Look around, Alea. His promises mean nothing. He's lost control of his own people, and now we're the ones paying the price." Alea felt the sting of Rhea's words like a blade to the chest. She had gambled on Edrin, on diplomacy, on finding a peaceful solution, and she had lost. Now she was leading her crew into the very heart of the storm, and there was no way out but through. Another explosion rocked the building, and the balcony trembled beneath their feet. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling as the ground beneath them shook. The planet itself seemed to be crumbling, torn apart by the fury of its warring factions. Rhea grabbed Alea's arm, her grip tight and unrelenting. "Please, don't let us die here." Alea's eyes met Rhea's, and for a moment, the chaos around them seemed to fade. She saw the fear in Rhea's eyes, the vulnerability hidden beneath the steel, and the depth of her words struck harder than any battlefield threat. It wasn't just the crew Rhea was trying to save, it was Alea herself. "Get everyone to the shuttle," Alea ordered, her voice firmer now, her decision made. "We're pulling out." Rhea nodded, relief flashing briefly across her face before she turned and shouted the order to the crew. The sound of hurried footsteps and frantic voices filled the air as they began their retreat, making their way to the shuttle that awaited them in the hangar below. But Alea didn't move. She stood frozen for a moment, staring out at the ruined city below, watching as Alcyon Prime burned. This was supposed to have been their new beginning, their chance to rebuild and thrive. Now it was nothing but ash and broken dreams. Her communicator crackled to life at her belt. "Captain Saris," came Edrin's voice, strained and distant, but still carrying that air of composed detachment. "You need to leave immediately. The situation is beyond my control." Alea pressed the communicator to her lips, anger flaring in her chest. "You promised us safety, Edrin. You said we would be protected." "I tried," he replied, his voice faltering for the first time. "But there are forces at play that even I could not anticipate. Leave now, before it's too late." "Too late?" Alea's voice trembled with fury. "It's already too late." There was no answer, only the cold, empty static of a man who had abandoned them to their fate. Rage burned hot in her veins, but it was futile now. There was no point in blaming Edrin, no point in clinging to the shattered remnants of what could have been. Alcyon Prime was lost. And if she didn't act, her people would be lost with it. She turned and ran, the sound of battle ringing in her ears as she made her way through the crumbling halls of the outpost. The shuttle bay was a storm of panic and confusion, the crew racing to board as enemy fire rained down from the hills outside. Rhea stood near the ramp, barking orders, her face set in a mask of determination. But when she saw Alea, her expression softened. Just for a moment, just enough to remind Alea that there was something left to fight for. "Are we clear?" Alea asked, breathless as she reached Rhea's side. "Almost," Rhea replied, her eyes scanning the remaining crew. "We've lost a few, but most are on board." Alea nodded, her throat tightening with the weight of her choices. "We need to lift off. Now." They boarded the shuttle, and within minutes, the engines roared to life. The ground below them shuddered as they ascended. The ruins of Alcyon, growing smaller and smaller in the distance. Alaya stared out the viewport as the planet receded. Its once vibrant cities now consumed by fire and destruction. She had come here to save humanity, to find a future for her people. But in the end, all she had found was ruin. As they broke through the atmosphere, leaving Alcyon behind, Rhea came to stand beside her. Neither of them spoke for a long time, the silence between them filled with the weight of what had been lost. But as Rhea's hand brushed against hers just briefly, Alaya felt a flicker of something. Hope, maybe, or at least the faintest glimmer of it. "We'll find another way," Rhea said quietly, her voice steady. "We'll survive this, together." Alaya closed her eyes, her body trembling with the exhaustion of battle and the toll of leadership. She wanted to believe Rhea's words, wanted to trust that they could somehow endure. But as the shuttle carried them into the void, leaving behind the burning world of Alcyon, she wasn't sure how much more they had left to give. All she knew was that they were still alive. And for now, that would have to be enough. The soft hum of the Aurora's dream was a stark contrast to the chaos they had left behind on Alcyon Prime. Inside the ship, everything was quiet, almost peaceful. But Captain Alaya Saras knew better. Peace was an illusion, fragile and fleeting, just like the hope she had once clung to when they first arrived at Alcyon. Now, as they drifted away from the burning planet, that hope felt like ash in her hands. She stood in the dim light of her private quarters, staring at the starfield beyond the window. The crew was safe, or at least those who had survived the battle were. But they had left so much behind. Supplies, technology, and the fragile dream of a new home, lost in the fires of a war that was never theirs to fight. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, eyes hollow, shoulders tense. She didn't look like the same woman who had confidently led this mission, who had believed that diplomacy could save them. The weight of failure sat heavy on her chest, constricting her breath with every passing second. The door to her quarters slid open, and Rhea stepped inside, her presence filling the room in a way that both comforted and unsettled Alaya. She had always been the steady force at Alaya's side, grounding her when the burden of command grew too heavy. But now, even Rhea's calm seemed brittle, stretched thin by everything they had been through. "You should rest," Rhea said softly, her voice almost a whisper. She crossed the room, her footsteps barely audible on the cold metal floor. "The crew's stable for now. They'll manage without you for a few hours." Alaya didn't move, didn't turn away from the stars. She wanted to speak, to tell Rhea that sleep wouldn't come even if she tried. There was too much swirling in her mind, guilt, regret, and that nagging sense that she had failed not just as a captain, but as a leader. But instead, she said nothing. Rhea came to stand beside her, close enough that Alaya could feel the heat of her body. They were silent together for a long moment, both staring out into the void, both trying to make sense of what came next. Finally, Alaya spoke, her voice thick with exhaustion. "I thought we could save them. I really did." Rhea's gaze shifted to her, the softness in her eyes cutting through Alaya's walls like a blade. "You did everything you could, Alaya. No one could have predicted what happened down there. Edrin, the factions, it was out of our hands." Alaya shook her head, the words catching in her throat. "We lost people, good people. And for what? To be used as pawns in a war we didn't understand? I should have seen it sooner. I should have—" "Stop," Rhea interrupted, her tone firm but gentle. She reached out, placing a hand on Alaya's arm, grounding her in the present. "You've been carrying this alone for too long. We made choices, all of us. And we'll carry those losses with us, but it wasn't your fault. You're not the only one who lost something." Alaya turned to look at her, really look at her, for the first time since they had left Alcyon. The lines of stress were etched into Rhea's face, the weight of their shared burdens visible in the tiredness of her eyes. And yet, there was something else there, something deeper that had been building between them, unspoken for too long. The silence between them stretched, heavy with everything they had never said, everything they had pushed aside in the name of duty and survival. But now, there was no more room for silence, not after everything they had been through together. "I thought I'd lost you down there," Alaya admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Her chest tightened at the memory of Rhea in the thick of battle, of the chaos and gunfire tearing through the air. The thought of losing her had been unbearable. Rhea's hand tightened on her arm, the warmth of her touch spreading through Alaya like a lifeline. "You'll never lose me," she said quietly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "No matter what happens, I'm with you, always." Alaya's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel it, the connection between them that had always been there, simmering beneath the surface. It was raw and real, and it scared her as much as it steadied her. But after everything they had survived, after all the fractures and losses, there was no denying it anymore. Without thinking, Alaya stepped closer, her hand brushing against Ria's. The touch was tentative, uncertain, but it was enough to send a ripple of electricity through her skin. Ria didn't pull away. Instead, she closed the space between them, her forehead resting gently against Alaya's. They stood like that for a long time, the stars outside casting them in a soft, dim glow. Neither spoke, but they didn't need to. The connection between them was enough. It was an unspoken promise, forged in the fires of war and loss, and it was stronger than anything they had faced. Finally, Ria pulled back just enough to meet Alaya's gaze, her voice quiet but resolute. "We'll find a way. Maybe not on Alcyon, maybe not today, but we will find a future for our people, together." Alaya felt the weight of Ria's words settle into her chest, a flicker of hope in the darkness. She had lost so much, made mistakes she couldn't take back, but in that moment, she realized that the future wasn't about the past. It wasn't about the failures or the losses. It was about the choices they made from here on out, and the person she made those choices with. Alaya nodded, a small, fragile smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Together," she echoed, the word carrying the weight of everything she felt but couldn't yet put into words. Ria smiled back, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Alaya felt the faintest stirrings of peace. They turned back to the stars, standing side by side, the silent hum of the ship their only companion. Somewhere out there, in the vast expanse of the universe, was a future waiting to be forged. It wouldn't be easy. There would be battles ahead, and choices that would test them both. But as long as they faced it together, Alaya knew they would find their way, and this time they would survive.